All right. Welcome back, everybody. We're in our second part of our interview with Professor Webb, and we were talking about Lucretius' theory of the atoms, and the clinamen. So, go right ahead.
Thank you, George. Yeah, so um, Lucretius has this very interesting element in his thinking, the clinamen, which is this deviation that an atom makes from its path, and as a consequence of that deviation, it collides with other atoms, because otherwise they would have just been raining down in perfectly parallel lines without meeting, so nothing would happen. So from the deviation then comes collision, which leads to turbulence, and within turbulence you have these vortical movements, these vortices, which Serres describes as forms of regularity. These are already forms of order, and he has a favourite image that he uses a lot of standing on a bridge and looking down over a big fast-flowing river, and it doesn't flow in a straight line with perfectly parallel flow. There are little currents and eddies and whirls and so on. And the vortices are like this. They might just a little local pattern where the water goes round and round and round, and there's water flowing into this, it's flowing out of this, but there's a pattern here which is repeated and holds together and sustains itself over time. And in effect, this is the analogue for a world in Lucretian terms, because the universe is this flow of atoms and worlds form. And Lucretius himself is quite clear that we cannot assume that other worlds are like ours, follow the same rules and patterns as our own. So what you have then, as a consequence of atoms, the clinamen, and the void, which creates discontinuity, is locality, is the fact that all patterns of order are local, both in space and time, right? And that's really important for it's one of the important lessons that Serres draws out of Lucretius's work. So you have then, for him, atoms are not the yes, atoms combine to form things which we can then see as part of the world that we live in and become us as well, of course. But the really crucial thing here is not that the atoms are building blocks as if they were little things. Lucretian atomism, which draws very much on Epicurus, not Democritus, Lucretian atomism is about flows, it's about fluids, it's about all the forms of complexity that come with fluid flow, fluid dynamics, including, primarily non-linearity, really. So thinking of the world in terms of atoms in the way that Lucretius does opens us to a world which is where order is local, where no order is fixed and permanent forever, and where ultimately, even though there are local patterns of order, everything is ultimately connected, because atoms will flow out from one local system eventually into another. So you have all these characteristics coming out of Lucretian atomism, which Serres finds really interesting. It's a pattern of it's consistent with thermodynamic thinking, because it describes the breakdown of systems, and it describes what we are familiar with as entropy today. But because of the locality of systems, and because of the clinomen, there is also negentropy. There is also the possibility that order forms. So when we look at any individual, any local form of order, we know that it is bound to break down eventually. Right? But first of all, things can happen that sustain that pattern of order in existence for longer. Right? It's not a straight dive down to the end, you know. That path can take different turns, and that system can follow that path at different speeds, if you like. But also, even if that order, that local order breaks down, something else will form and occur somewhere else, time or space later, or at a different point. So you have this idea of entropy that we're familiar with, as order breaks down, as the order, the pattern of regularities that atoms are held in gradually unravels as they flow, but also that something else would emerge. So that's another way in which he finds a very contemporary thought in Lucretius. So one of the, as I've described it there, Serres is sort of drawing out all the ideas from Lucretius, and he does. But in fact, the way that Serres' thinking works is that this Lucretius's text is not a foundational text for him, in the sense that these same ideas were already forming and emerging and developing in his thinking in relation to other thinkers and other places, other texts, other ways of thinking, and so on. And what he's doing in what Serres is doing in his thinking is connecting these, and as each connection is made, then those ideas take on a particular consistency in that locality. So he was already thinking about networks. He was already thinking about networks, and he was already thinking about flows and so on, because of work that he'd done in the history of philosophy and in the history of mathematics, and in information theory and so on. Right? And then he sees these ideas operating in Lucretius, but of course, in thinking through those ideas in the context of Lucretius, they take on a particular form and consistency, as I say. So it's not simply repeating the same ideas from one place to another, but he's seeing similar things recurring in similar but not identical ways, as he traces a way of thinking from one locality of thought, one way of thinking, one historical configuration of thought, for example, to another. So now, one of the characteristics, one of the things that comes out of this, and it's very much there in his work on Lucretius, but also elsewhere, is that in a sense, Lucretius is our contemporary. Right? So he's not just some ancient figure who's separated from us by over 2,000 years of history and philosophy and science, and is therefore remote and just a figure for historical study. He is our contemporary, right? Because time, in fact, does not flow in like a huge river all in one go with in linear fashion, but is more complex, and he has this idea of a kind of multiple times, and of times being connected in what is a topological space. So Lucretius is close to us, because actually his thinking is very much like our own. And in that way, we are close to Lucretius rather than separated by more than 2,000 years. Yeah, and all of these things, and lots more. I mean, I could talk about that book and all the things in it for longer than we have today, because it's a favourite book of mine. But those are some of the things which come out of Serres' thinking about Lucretius.
Thank you. Thank you. That's beautiful, actually. And as we are sort of approaching, well, not quite there, but slowly approaching the conclusion of our talk. Well, there's once again a lot of themes I would like to talk about, because this problem of time and this nonlinear understanding of time, and seeing the flow of time as something that belongs more to literature and poetry, as being more apt in describing this type of time while remaining scientific, right? That's the key point. We might use a poetical language to describe time, or in Foucault's case, to talk about history, but nonetheless, our method conforms more or less to the modern epistemic beliefs of contemporary science, right? And that's what I found, even if it's not entirely true, that's what I found so inspiring in Foucault's style of writing, right? Because I think both Foucault and Serres, not to mention Lucretius, were accused, or would have been accused by today's standards, of being poetic, and being poetic is often it has this resonance of critique, right? It's obscure, it's poetic, and so this shows in a way that Foucault's way of writing literary histories, situated histories, and Serres' way of addressing 15 different epochs or themes within one paragraph, right? These can be, we can talk about these as scientific methodologies, right?
We can, and that's a really good point. And something which Serres said in one of his interviews, when he's asked about the importance of mathematics for him, because Serres was very well trained in mathematics and very interested in mathematics, fully engaged with it, understood it very deeply, and he says lots of very interesting things about how mathematics relates to his way of thinking, really. One of those things he says is that he understood from mathematics how to make connections between things. And the virtue in mathematics is to make connections between things and to do it in the simplest, most elegant way possible, just to move quickly. Whereas I think he feels that you can take work in philosophy, and the virtue is to go slowly, is to take all the possible steps that you can in order to don't miss anything else. Put it all in there. Everything has to be covered. And actually, Serres from that's not how mathematics thinks. Mathematics draws connections and moves quickly, and he sought to adopt a mathematical way of thinking in his philosophical writing. Now, that idea needs to be supplemented with one or two more. One of which is that for Serres, thinking takes place in a space which is, and you've alluded to it already, I mentioned it already, Georgie, thinking takes place in a space which is topological rather than geometrical. Right? And the significance of this for Serres is that rigor is not produced by measure, basically. Rigor is not, so measurement is not the condition for rigor. Okay. So, for example, to go back to the example we've discussed already of Lucretius, we can say that Lucretius is close to us because we haven't measured and counted the years between us. decided that it's a long time, and actually someone who, from last century, is actually much closer to us than Lucretius. It could be the reverse. It could be the reverse. It is the reverse in many cases. And there's also this last point may not be quite so relevant to Foucault. I'm not sure, but he also describes how he had this revelation when he was at school when his teacher started doing algebra on the board, and he realized he could do sums with letters. And and he said, all of these equations put up on the board and things, these sums, but they're with letters, they're with any value. And that was right, okay. So we can think about the relations between things without having to specify what those things are. Right, okay, fine. So now we can begin to think about how to establish ways of thinking that compile relations and relations between relations and so on, without having to begin uniquely from the thing, actually, because actually multiple things can fit into that set of relations. So, okay, interesting. That's something which he explores very much in his own work. Now, I said earlier that I was rather wary of including biographical detail in explanations, but I'll break my own rule here. We know, of course, also that Michel Serres and Michel Foucault were not only colleagues at Clermont-Ferrand through the first 5-6 years of the 1960s until Foucault left to found the Department of Philosophy at the University of they were not only colleagues, but they were friends, and they shared an office, and they spoke a lot and discussed questions all the time. Right. I was told once by somebody who'd spoken with Serres that about Foucault this period of time, and said that when The Order of Things, Le Mot et la Chose, was published, Foucault sent him a copy inscribed to my friend Michel, because half of this book is yours.
Wow.
Afterwards, I think Serres lost a little bit of patience with Foucault over a few things, but he was, for a time, very good friends with him, and they discussed a lot of matters. So a lot of these ways of thinking about history, which are informed by mathematics, and ways of thinking about experience, which I would say are also informed by information theory. That would be maybe another discussion. Yeah, I don't want to say I'm breaking my rule here by talking about the idea of influence, but Foucault is certainly talking about these ideas and discussing these ideas all the way through the period of that early 60s as he was developing this way of thinking, really. And while I don't want to pin it down too closely, I think that would be a mistake. The idea that some of these ways of thinking find their place in his work is perhaps not that surprising.
Okay. Well, thank you. Yeah, once again, very interesting stuff. More questions than answers, as always. And as you mentioned, the influence of cybernetic theory on French thought in that period is actually a very interesting topic that I think is explored in separate books. So maybe on another occasion we'll discuss that as well.
Yeah, that would be very nice. To be happy to do that. Yes, I don't know if there's anywhere further about taking Foucault. Really.
Well, I would like to go back to Foucault a little bit and talk about the later Foucault a little bit. The Foucault of power, the Foucault of paresia, of courageous truth, and maybe if we can sort of push this towards a summary where we can ask ourselves, how can we use Foucault's and Serres' findings to be a little more critical about what people think science is and is not? And how we, despite thinking that we believe in science and we have faith in science, a very dangerous combination of words, faith and science. But a lot of people do say that. They say, I believe in science, I have faith in science. Um, and that's maybe that's fine, I don't know. But so my question is, how can we break away from an old episteme while evaluating the
Yeah.
most contemporary conclusions and findings in science? And how can we use Foucault for that?
No, it's an interesting, very interesting question. All right, I've got a number of things. I won't put a number on it, so just in case. A number of things I think I could that I'd want to say in response to that, okay, but without having fully formed response, I think. One point would be that Foucault, we've talked about this before, Foucault is always intent on the specifics, really. And so I guess my first thought would be that we would need to frame the question in terms of particular sciences rather than science.
Mm-hmm.
Science, that's too big, that's too broad, right? So we need to be thinking about particular sciences that we have a relation to and or that speak in particular ways and so forth. Right? The next point that occurs to me is that, and you will know this perfectly well, Georgie, of course, that Foucault is always chooses not to engage in the question of legitimacy. It's never about, is this a legitimate form of knowledge, or is this a legitimate science? That question of legitimation forms part of a certain post-Kantian tradition of philosophy of science, if you like, which is not his. Okay. Just to fill in the gaps there a little bit, remember that when he's thinking about about conditions of knowledge, he's thinking about these conditions for this knowledge. This is something we spoke about earlier on, right? Not universal conditions for knowledge or any particular form of experience. We were talking about experience earlier on, but essentially the same sort of same argument applies. We're not looking at conditions which legitimize a whole body of knowledge, so we can't look at that body of knowledge, determine what it says about the world. So, but is this well formed? Yes. Has it does it adhere to the correct methodology? Has it is it consistent with its axiomatic base and so on and so on? And okay, yeah, it's a science and it's doing its work in the right way, so it's legitimate. He doesn't think in that way. He's not interested in the questions. He's more interested in the questions of how does this science, if it is a science, right? There are one or two other further questions there to do with how discourses, disciplines establish themselves as sciences. But let's just say we're talking about a science. He's interested more in how does it conduct itself as a science? What is it? How does it live as a science? Right? What is it decides to be a science? What does it do as a science? Those are the questions that he's interested in, which actually in some ways are quite phenomenological questions in a way. If I could this might be a bit of a stretch, but for me it makes sense to think here a little bit of Heidegger and say his question about existence. It's not asking about the conditions for existence. It's saying, what is it for Dasein to be? What is its way of being? I mean, we're asking about the being of something, the ontology of something. We're asking not about its essence in some physical sense, but its way of being. And I think Foucault is actually asking a similar question about science. It's what are science's way of being, if you like? How do they conduct themselves? Which, of course, translates into what do they say? What do they do? Who do they affect? Who speak? How are they organised? And all of those questions become basically how you develop that initial impulse to ask, what is it like to be a science? This science, not any science, this one. And Serres, I think, is important here again, an interesting figure again, because this isn't something which he initiated himself, but he drew attention to this fact that within the mathematical sciences, around the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, around that sort of period of time, it became apparent to people working in the field that they were no longer dealing with a discourse which then had a separate meta-discourse that dealt with all of the epistemological questions within the field. Right? Instead, the discourse of mathematics, if you want to call it a discourse, mathematics itself inquired into and settled its own epistemological questions. And that was enormously important for Serres, and it becomes, again, something of a model for his thinking more broadly. I think we can see something similar in Foucault here, where if we think about statements, networks of statements, configurations of statements, how these form into groups of statements, how they become established and formalized in certain ways within a discourse, potentially even within a science. There isn't some separate body of knowledge or discourse which stands over all of this and says, yeah, but have they done it correctly? Is this the correct formation? Is this a legitimate formation? These shifts, dislocations, reconfigurations of statements into discourses produce ways of thinking, discourses, and potentially sciences. Right? And yes, to be recognized as a science, that discipline must pass over certain thresholds of formalization, right? But there isn't any outside body legitimating that progress to say, oh yes,
right.
You've done it correctly, it's phase 3, now you've phase 4, you've done it science. We find ourselves committed to these things already. It's a science. Is it not a science? Is it not? The whole question about whether psychoanalysis was a science or whether Marxism is a science and those sort of issues, I think Foucault found rather pointless. Well, they do what they do, and they're real, and they tell us things, and they're interesting, and they have effects, and they work on problems, and actually the question of whether they're a science or not is a false question, really. It's either a question which is coming from a position of power, trying to delegitimize them, or it's coming from a position of subservience, thinking if only we could become a science, then maybe we'll be taken more seriously. But actually, both impulses are just pointless and wrong for him. Yeah, they're not what's interesting. So yeah, we end up then with a situation we find ourselves with sciences. You know, it's very hard for us to come along today and go, oh yeah, well actually let us begin again this analysis of whether we think cosmology is a science or not. Yeah. It seems almost an absurd question because it's there, it's doing things. It itself helps to inform what science is in our eyes. You know? So to come to your question then, what can be our position towards it? Because I think you were saying, how can we take up, what could it be to take up a critical relation here? Mm-hmm. That remains an absolutely crucial question, I think. Absolutely crucial question. And first of all, I think for Foucault, and again, I know you know this very well, Georgie, but it's not a question of trying to legitimize or delegitimize that knowledge on the basis of prior or external conditions or criteria. Right? That's not his approach for all the reasons we've talked about. But it doesn't mean that there's no recourse to a critical attitude. Yeah, and that we can see this through all of Foucault's work. And I have to say, I'm particularly interested in this idea of critique in Foucault and what it's doing there and how it works. And it brings us back to the question of power that you talked about before, because whenever we have an organised body that is knowledge, an organised body of knowledge, or something that is passing for knowledge, should we say, right? Then there are power effects that come with this. There are power relations that come with this. So when I say, but the fact is we always find ourselves kind of already within this science. You know, we already accept that cosmology is a science, or that organic chemistry is a science, and it would seem a little bit odd for us now to go to question that. But they may not be the most interesting examples, I suppose. Because there are sciences which proclaim certain truths, proclaim a certain way of seeing the world, and that promulgate, that create power relations of certain kinds. Okay. Which means certain imbalances, certain people with certain authority to speak about other people in certain ways, or to induce actions of certain kinds from them, and so on, yeah? To produce certain kinds of subject. And it remains the case with Foucault that we can always question this, right? And he writes about this in an interesting way, saying that traditionally we've understood that one can be critical in relation to truth in order to in effect be critical with relation to power. And what do I mean? Well, that we can ask about truth in order to determine what is the case with power. Right? So if I know the truth about something, then I will know whether the power relation that I'm in, the power is being exercised on me or around me, is in accordance with truth or not. Is true power or false power legitimate or illegitimate? Right? But of course, that's not Foucault's perspective. the reasons we've said. Right? In fact, he says it's the reverse. What I can do is refuse power, dissent, and through that dissent, basically question truth.
And he does say explicitly, right, that truth has effects of power that might be more disruptive, more significant than those of error or those of, ideology, as they like to say. So truth might be more dangerous sometimes.
Truth might be more dangerous, and there's, of course, we then have to think about, well, what truth or what truths are we speaking about here? I don't think there's any single one straightforward answer to that question, at least as I understand it. But it seems to me that let's think of a couple of ways that one might answer that question. The truth might be that we are going to openly speak the truth about the contribution of fossil fuels to the climate emergency, right? And we know that this is going on, but it's also something which is kind of ignored by a lot of people a lot of the time. Okay, so let's declare this, and that, of course, is disruptive to certain things. Disruptive to certain potential risks, which, of course, is something which he said is associated with parasia, with speaking the truth, is that it comes with a risk to the one who speaks, depending on where one speaks and how one speaks and so forth. So there's that sense of, well, I can just say, look, there's something here that needs to be said. That could be that. I think that's a perfectly real way to think about this, a perfectly fair way to think about this. I think one can go back, way back to much earlier stages of his thinking as well. When he was back in the 1950s, when he was writing about psychiatry and Binswanger, and the idea of Binswanger had this idea of trying to identify the a priori conditions of an existence, and Foucault was very interested in this idea and certain ways that Binswanger was setting about doing this, but he was also took his distance from it a little bit because it's implied too fixed an anthropology in the end, right? About what we are as human beings. And so when we see that Foucault comes along in his work on madness, for example, right? There is, to use that terminology, there's a different a priori. There's a different set of conditions for that existence. Right? But he does at certain points refer to this in terms of truth. Right? There's truth to this. Right? So in speaking truth, yes, we can say that I'm bringing certain facts to do with the climate emergency to people's attention. In speaking truth, we could also say that what I'm doing is putting my existence into words. I'm speaking my existence, right? Putting it
a situated existence, right?
Sorry?
My situated in existence, my contextual state of affairs.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's right. And of course, as soon as you say that, all of those analyses of Foucault about about the way that one speaks, about discourse, about the inducement to speak oneself, to put oneself into discourse, about the whole history of confession as a practice of putting oneself into discourse, which then gets revised and repeated in modernity in different ways and so on, all comes back. So the question then immediately is, what words? How does that spoken? What could one possibly do or say? Because the moment one speaks that way, one gives oneself over, one loses oneself as well, because one speaks a finite language, in the very finite language, which will cast your existence in a particular light, in a particular way, and cast it into a set of relations, which will be power relations as well, of course. But so the moment you do that, there is no pure way to do it. There is no perfect way to do it. But doing it in a way which diverges, just to introduce the idea of the Klineman again a little bit here, which diverges from what is generally accepted, the mainstream, or what has been accepted as normal, etc., etc. If there's any way of doing this which just breaks a little bit, then that is actually a critical act.
And that's resistance, right? That's resistance.
Sorry?
So that would be resistance, right? That attempt in itself is an act of resistance. That's being subversive.
It is a subversive act. It's a critical act. It's a dissenting act, which calls into question simply by virtue of its difference. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, that's yeah. I especially like that a lot of what you said, because it ties in with the very title of the channel, right, which is called The Silence of Savoir, the Science of Knowledge, right? And because in Madness and Civilization, Foucault says that his aim was to write an archaeology of a particular type of silence.
Yes.
And if I'm not mistaken, he referred to specifically the Silence of Savoir, which was the practices that led to incarceration, the formation of mental illness, the construction of mental illness in a sense, right, and so forth.
Yeah.
So even though the silence part of the channel's title should refer to Wittgenstein, in this case it refers back to Foucault again, together with the savoir. So that's pretty neat. I like that. So yeah, let's just conclude on a final, just several comments on one more sort of dichotomy that Foucault has made between savoir and connaissance. If you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. The first thing is that he describes this in slightly different ways in different places, and so it's hard to give a single correct or authoritative determination of this, but something along the following lines, at least, that connaissance is the French word for knowledge, where this is the knowledge that you and I know. It's the knowledge we have. It's the knowledge of the subject. The things that the subject can read, assimilate, talk about, put into language. There it is. It's knowledge at that level and in that form. Savoir is the much less obvious collection of relations and of ways of and practices and ways of doing things, which effectively serve as a sort of set of conditions for connaissance. Really. You can't have a particular body of knowledge without certain, for example, without certain institutional forms that involve certain relations and certain practices. Well, Savoir would be bedded into those practices and relations. We'd have to think about what they are and how they work and so forth. And that would be the level at which Savoir is operating. So it's that formative, almost forming strata of relations, practices, which is not normally made explicit and hasn't become formulated into an explicit body of knowledge, but is nonetheless determines ways of dealing with things, ways of thinking, what connections can be drawn, how they can be drawn, ultimately how we speak, or what we can speak of, and so on. Yeah. And so hence the Archaeology of Knowledge, that famous book by Foucault, is an Archaeology of Savoir. It's that level of this network, this vast network of connections and relations, and bedded into those networks of connections and relations, ways of doing, thinking, speaking, relating. That's the Savoir level.
Perfect. And that's what one would be doing today. As you said before, if we are to do a Foucauldian analysis of what's going on in the sciences, right? We would have to do a specific, concrete sort of getting to the positivity of the Savoir type of analysis of sciences if we want to do a critique.
Yes, absolutely. That's entirely right. So I sort of, in response to your question, I sort of went off in one direction. We were talking about critique in terms of that dissent, and that dissenting moment. But yes, that's quite right. We could also look at that whole strata, multiple stratas of out of which these discourses emerge and form themselves into something more sort of rigid and consistent. And again, just to say, the point of that would be, to my understanding, not to delegitimize a science or legitimize it, but to, as Foucault says repeatedly about the practice of critique, genealogical or archaeological, and that is to expose the historical contingency of ways of thinking. And I think for me, what that actually connects back to my first response about being critical in terms of dissent and so on, because that dissenting moment becomes easier if we can see that the discourse we're dissenting from is historical, contingent, limited to certain ways, sprang out of a particular coincidence of things at a particular point, at a particular time, and then that gives us a freedom which we don't experience, at least if we feel that we're just dealing with something inevitable around us.
Absolutely. So getting rid of those universal notions or totalizing narratives, right? Big part of
exactly getting rid of all of that. Keep all focused back on specificity, historical uniqueness, the fact that there's no grand current of history going along here, or no overarching discourse that justifies all the others. It's all about chance connections, producing things, which sort of neatly brings us back to Lucretius as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
But it is about that idea as a collection of chance connections. In the end, of course, they're not. Each step is never completely random because it's conditioned by the ones that have come before in certain ways. But ultimately, there's a contingency accident which runs through all of it.
Okay. Well, perfect. I mean, that was wonderful. Really, really inspiring. Everything we've covered, the whole conversation, very interesting stuff. And yeah, as I said, I mean, I personally could sit here all day and continue this conversation. But I do hope we can have more interviews, more conversations in the future. Perhaps address the cybernetic hypothesis, as they say. So thank you, David. Thank you so much. We're gonna end on that note.
It's been a pleasure, Georgie. Thank you very much for arranging